The Canadian wilderness is a place of unparalleled beauty and mystery, where the vast expanses of untouched forests and pristine lakes stretch as far as the eye can see. But beneath this serene exterior lies a darker, more sinister reality. The wilderness holds secrets older than time itself, whispered on the wind, chilling tales passed down through generations. Among these whispers, one legend strikes fear into the hearts of even the bravest souls, the Wendigo. A creature of insatiable hunger, relentless pursuit, and a chilling transformation from man to monster. Is it a myth designed to keep people from venturing too deep into the unknown, or is it a terrifying reality? If you're brave enough, keep watching. Welcome to Blue Mythology. This is the story of the Wendigo. It was a year when the moose were scarce, and the hunting expedition led by Dr. Cathcart took an unexpected turn. The group, consisting of the seasoned guides Hank and Defago, the young and inexperienced nephew Simpson, and their Native American cook Punk, ventured deep into the Canadian wilderness. The air was thick with tension as days passed without a single moose sighting. The scarcity of game weighed heavily on the group, and the mood grew increasingly somber. Hank, the more experienced of the two guides, suggested splitting up to cover more ground. He proposed that Defago and Simpson take a canoe up the lake to explore a rarely visited area known as 50 Island Water. Defago's reaction to this plan was peculiar. A skilled woodsman and usually fearless, he suddenly seemed uneasy, even afraid. This brief flicker of fear on his face did not go unnoticed by the others. Hank tried to brush it off as mere superstition, but Dr. Cathcart, a psychologist by profession, sensed something deeper lurking beneath the surface. The atmosphere grew even stranger when Punk, their cook, silently approached the group. His presence seemed to unsettle Hank, who abruptly changed the subject. As the group retired for the night, an unsettling feeling lingered in the air, as if the wilderness itself was watching them. In the early hours of the morning, while the camp slept, Punk awoke. He stood by the lake, alert and wary, as if sensing something in the darkness. Perhaps it was the peculiar scent that drifted through the camp, a faint, acrid odor that none could place. The camp stirred to life before dawn, the air crisp from the overnight snow. The smell of coffee and bacon lifted spirits as the group prepared to split up. Hank, now jovial, wished Defago and Simpson luck as they loaded their canoe. Only Punk remained at the main camp, his expression unreadable. As Simpson and Defago paddled across the lake, the breathtaking wilderness surrounded them. The vastness of the untamed forest, stretching all the way to Hudson Bay, filled Simpson with a sense of awe and exhilaration. For Simpson, this journey was an initiation into the true wilderness, a place where the primeval forest dwarfed him, making him acutely aware of his vulnerability and reliance on Defago's expertise. By evening, they reached 50 Island Water. Defago set up camp while Simpson cleaned their catch. As night fell, the beauty of their isolated spot was both wondrous and slightly unsettling. Over supper, they shared stories and laughter, but an undercurrent of unease persisted. When Simpson remarked on the vastness of the woods, Defago agreed somberly, "There's no end to them, no end at all." The mood shifted when Defago began to sing an old Voyager song. Midway through, he stopped abruptly, and sniffing the air like an animal sensing danger. His sudden change in demeanor alarmed Simpson. "What's wrong?" Simpson asked. "I never said I heard or smelt anything," Defago replied shakily. "Just taking a look around." A silence fell over the camp. The vast wilderness seemed to close in, and an inexplicable sense of dread hung in the air. Simpson awoke to the soft lapping of water outside the tent, his heart racing. A new sound stirred feelings of pity and alarm. It was coming from inside the tent. Defago was sobbing into his blankets. "Defago," Simpson whispered gently. "What's wrong? Are you in pain?" There was no reply. The sobbing stopped. Simpson touched the figure, who didn't move, then covered his exposed feet with a blanket. "Let me know if anything's wrong," he said. As Simpson lay back down, Defago's sobbing haunted him, leaving an unease he couldn't rationalize. The darkness pressed in, the vast forest looming just beyond their tent. Their small camp felt incredibly vulnerable, a tiny island of humanity in an ocean of wild, unknowable nature. Simpson awoke suddenly, aware of a violent movement beside him. Defago sat bolt upright, trembling uncontrollably. Dawn's pale light outlined his shaking form against the canvas of the tent. Hours must have passed since they'd gone to sleep. Before Simpson could fully wake, an otherworldly sound shattered the forest silence. It was a voice, possibly human, yet not quite, hoarse and plaintive, immense yet seductive. It called out, seeming to come from above. "Defago!" The sound was unlike anything Simpson had ever heard. Both lonely and terrifyingly powerful, it sent chills down his spine. Defago sprang up, blundering against the tent pole. He burst through the flaps and vanished into the pre-dawn forest as he fled. His voice carried back to Simpson, filled with both anguish and a strange exhilaration. "Oh, my feet of fire! My burning feet of fire! Oh, this heightened fiery speed!" Then silence descended once more. Dazed, Simpson emerged from the tent. The gray dawn revealed their campsite, the dew-soaked tent, smoldering ashes, misty lake, but no sign of Defago. An unfamiliar, pungent scent hung in the air, quickly fading. Panic set in. Simpson ran aimlessly through the woods, shouting Defago's name until he was hoarse, exhausted, and disoriented. He barely managed to find his way back to camp. After regaining his composure over a hastily prepared breakfast, Simpson decided to search methodically for Defago. He left a note at the campsite and set off with supplies. Not far from camp, he discovered tracks in the snow, large animal prints alongside human footprints. For a moment, he thought he'd found a simple explanation. A moose had startled Defago into fleeing. But as he followed the trail, he realized this theory couldn't account for the guide's bizarre behavior. The wilderness loomed around him, indifferent and vast. As Simpson pressed on, the memory of Defago's cry echoed in his mind. Simpson's pragmatism helped him maintain his composure as he followed the tracks. However, what he discovered next tested his resolve to its limits. Both sets of tracks had changed alarmingly. The larger prints now had a mysterious reddish tinge around them. Even more disturbing, the human footprints had gradually morphed to resemble the larger tracks beside them. Suddenly, all traces vanished. Simpson searched frantically, but the trail had disappeared without explanation. In that moment of confusion, terror struck from high above. He heard Defago's voice, thin and wailing. "Oh, oh, this fiery height! Oh, my feet of fire, my burning feet of fire!" The sound shattered Simpson's calm composure. Overwhelmed by panic, he ran wildly, searching and calling. The wilderness seemed to close in around him, taunting and threatening. The journey was nightmarish, filled with imagined pursuers and unseen threats. He maintained his sanity by focusing on finding his way back. Back at camp, Simpson spent a sleepless night by the fire, rifle in hand. At dawn, he set out on the arduous journey back to the main camp for help. Relying on instinct and perhaps some innate sense of direction, Simpson found the hidden canoe. He paddled across the lake, guided by a compass and the distant glow of campfires. Close to midnight, he reached the main camp. Hank rushed to help the exhausted and shaken young man. Now, faced with the daunting task of explaining the inexplicable events of the past days, Simpson was afraid to share everything that had happened. Not knowing how the party would react, he shared enough for an immediate decision. A search party would set out as soon as possible. Simpson's initial account omitted vital details. He later admitted that his uncle's matter-of-fact demeanor made him hesitate to mention the more extraordinary aspects. The search party initially understood only that Defago had suffered an acute attack of mania, imagining himself called by something, and had fled into the wilderness without supplies. As they traveled the next day, Simpson revealed more to his uncle. Unaware of the subtle cross-examination, he mentioned Defago's references to the Wendigo, his nighttime cries, the unusual scent, and other signs of mental distress. Simpson described the extraordinary odor as pungent and acrid, like the odor of lions. Approaching 50 Island Water, Simpson admitted hearing Defago's cries for help, but couldn't bring himself to repeat the exact words. He described how Defago's footprints had changed, but admitted their impossible stride. He mentioned the fiery tinge in the snow, but hesitated to say the body had been partly dragged from the tent. Dr. Cathcart, considering himself an adept psychologist, explained away Simpson's experiences as products of a mind influenced by isolation and terror. He praised Simpson's courage while subtly undermining the credibility of his observations. The spell of these solitudes, he said, affects any imaginative mind. The animal was likely a moose. The track color was a vision defect due to excitement. The size of the tracks will be explained when we find them. Auditory hallucinations are common in such stress. The only puzzle is that odd odor. They reach the camp, finding it untouched except for animals raiding the food cache. The search began immediately, but fresh snow had covered all tracks. After hours of fruitless searching, they gathered around the fire, discussing their limited options. Dr. Cathcart spoke of people driven mad by wilderness solitude, suggesting this as Defago's fate. Hank reluctantly mentioned local Wendigo legends, explaining Defago's initial reluctance to hunt in the area. In this more sympathetic atmosphere, Simpson recounted his full experience, omitting only the strange language he'd heard. Dr. Cathcart remained skeptical, attributing Simpson's account to an imagination influenced by Defago's tales in the wilderness. As night fell, fear permeated the camp. Despite attempts to discuss other topics, the conversation invariably returned to their unsettling situation. Hank remained vigilant, always facing the dark forest, while Dr. Cathcart stayed close to the fire, his unease evident despite his rational explanations. The group's forced attempts at normalcy only heightened the sense of lurking danger in the vast, indifferent wilderness surrounding them. The snow muffled everything, wrapping them in silence except for their voices and the crackling of the fire. Occasionally a soft whisper, like a moth's wings, passed through the air. No one wanted to go to bed. As midnight approached, Dr. Cathcart broke the silence. The legend is picturesque enough. The Wendigo is like the call of the wild personified, drawing some to their destruction. That's about it. Hank replied, "You know when it calls your name." After another pause, Dr. Cathcart added, "The voice is said to mimic all the minor sounds of the forest, wind, water, animal cries. Once someone hears it, they're lost. They say the eyes and feet are most vulnerable. The feet for the lust of wandering, and the eyes for the lust of beauty. The victim moves so fast his feet burn, and he bleeds beneath his eyes." Simpson listened, horrified, but Hank's face fascinated him. The two men, normally strong, were now fearful of the silence. They talked to fend off panic, knowing they were in dangerous territory. Simpson, having already faced terror, felt more immune than the others. Time passed with lowered voices as they discussed the haunting legend. The wilderness seemed to press in on them, the fate of their missing comrade hanging over them heavily. After a long silence, Hank suddenly sprang to his feet and let out a yell into the night. "That's for Defago," he said with a defiant laugh. "I believe my old partner's nearby." His outburst shocked Simpson and made the doctor drop his pipe. Hank's face was pale, and Dr. Cathcart showed a momentary weakness. Just then, something large flew overhead with a rush of air, followed by a faint human cry of anguish. "Oh, my burning feet of fire!" Hank looked around, terrified. Dr. Cathcart turned instinctively toward the tent, frozen in fear. Simpson, trying to stay calm, recognized the voice. "That's the cry I heard, the exact words he called out to Defago. Defago, come down here to us!" Suddenly, they heard something heavy crashing through the trees, landing with a thud. "That's him! God help us!" Hank whispered, reaching for his knife. "He's coming," he added, laughing with horror as footsteps crunched through the snow toward them. The three men stood motionless around the fire, too terrified to move as the footsteps approached through the darkness, a sense of dread overwhelming them. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged, stepping into the flickering firelight. It was Defago, but he moved unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. As he came closer, the men saw his face, a mix of exhaustion and terror. "Here I am, Bart Simpson," he rasped. "I heard someone calling me." His voice was faint, as if he'd been through an ordeal. He laughed, but it was a dry, unsettling sound. Hank jumped up, swearing wildly, his presence strangely comforting to Simpson. Dr. Cathcart followed more slowly. Simpson felt dazed. The scene was surreal, but he heard his uncle firmly talking about food and warmth, trying to maintain control. Simpson finally spoke the question on everyone's mind. "Is it you, Defago?" Horror laced his voice. "Of course it is," Dr. Cathcart replied, overly emphatic. "He's just exhausted." But the figure by the fire, wrapped in blankets, was a ghastly parody of the man they knew. His face was animalistic, features distorted, skin loose, as if under immense pressure. Hank, overwhelmed, moved away from the fire and yelled, "You ain't Defago! That ain't you, my old pal!" His voice was filled with anger and heartbreak as Hank's emotions spiraled. He shouted incoherently, the woods echoing with his cries. Finally, he broke down in tears, and Dr. Cathcart led him to the tent to calm him. Dr. Cathcart then faced Defago, demanding, "Tell us what happened, just a little, so we can help you." But the face that turned up to him was so pitiful, so inhuman, that he recoiled in horror. Defago whispered, "I seen that great Wendigo thing. I've been with it." His voice was fading, becoming something else entirely. Suddenly, Hank's voice rang out from the tent. "His feet! Look at his feet!" Defago had shifted, revealing legs that were grotesquely transformed. Cathcart quickly wrapped the blankets around them, but Simpson only caught a glimpse of something dark and strange before anyone could react further. Defago stood up, his face twisted with malice. "You've seen my burning feet," he said. Then, with a rush of wind, the forest seemed to come alive, and he stumbled into the darkness, disappearing from sight. Moments later, a distant, anguished cry echoed through the trees. "Oh, my burning feet of fire!" Dr. Cathcart grabbed Hank as he tried to run after Defago, calming him with great effort. Simpson, usually composed, now lay in a state of hysteria, muttering about fiery apparitions. As night turned to dawn, Dr. Cathcart kept watch, battling his inner terror. When morning finally arrived, he woke the others. They packed up and left, deeply shaken but trying to regain a sense of order. As they trekked back, they spoke only of ordinary things, avoiding the painful memories that haunted them. Hank, more in tune with nature, recovered first. Dr. Cathcart struggled longer, his rational mind grappling with the inexplicable. Simpson and his uncle never discussed the details, but once Simpson asked about the strange odor they'd encountered. Dr. Cathcart simply said, "Odors aren't as easy to explain as sights and sounds." By the time they reached the camp at dusk, exhausted and hungry, they found it empty. No fire and no sign of Punk. Hank rushed ahead and knelt by the fireplace, embracing a figure among the ashes. It was Dago, alive but horribly changed, disfigured. Now a shell of his former self, he fumbled weakly with twigs and matches, unable to remember how to start a fire. His face was blank, devoid of any emotion or recognition. The essence of who he was had vanished forever. What they witnessed was more moving than anything before. Defago, with a vacant smile, pulled wads of moss from his cheeks, muttering about being a damned mosquito. He couldn't keep down food, and his feet were severely frostbitten, causing him immense pain. The details of his survival were unknown. His memory had completely vanished. By winter's end, Defago's mind and soul were lost. Punk later recounted seeing a shadow of Defago entering camp, preceded by that same strange odor. Terrified, he immediately left for home, knowing Defago had seen the Wendigo. The return journey was somber, once filled with dread. The forest seemed almost peaceful in its winter stillness. Simpson, Dr. Cathcart, and Hank walked in silence, reflecting on their experience. Simpson felt a sense of closure, his faith deepened by the encounter with the untamed wilderness. Dr. Cathcart remained pensive, his skepticism tempered by a respect for the mysteries of nature. Heartbroken by the loss of his friend, Hank found solace in returning to his routine. The shared ordeal forged an unspoken bond as they reached civilization. They had faced the Wendigo and survived, but the forest left a lasting mark, a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown. The fear of being devoured by a flesh-eating monster is deeply rooted in human psychology and is often reflected in our myths and folklore. Among the most terrifying figures born from these fears is the Wendigo, a cannibalistic creature from the indigenous lore of North America. Unlike popular culture's portrayal, the true essence of the Wendigo is far more complex and unsettling.